I'm going to build on what Richard and Jim said with a bit of a how-to for you guys, because I hope they've convinced you of the importance of the media in telling the story of global health. It's one thing to have a lot of money, which, you know, compared to 10 years ago, you certainly do now. It's another thing to get public buy-in, and I personally believe in the role of public buy-in, even if you've got all the money in the world. If the public doesn't understand, if the public understands what you're doing, understands some of the concepts and issues, it can only. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about gaps now in global news coverage, specifically mental health as an example, and then at the end come in with some lessons from you all, for you all, about what you can do if you're. I'll start with a little bit of Journalism 101, which is what makes news. What is news? Something that's changed recently, something people don't know about. Most importantly, it's something they'll be interested in. That challenge for global health news and global health reporters is, which is not specific to mental illness, which is getting people interested, on that last point, getting them interested in something that's happening far away to people who don't look like them. When the economy is bad, when the Huskies had a bad football loss, how do you get readers interested? And I've faced that challenge myself, and with reporters, of course, the first challenge is always editors, Jim aside. I was once pleading to do a whole series about the end of polio. This is back maybe 10 years ago when it looked like the goal might be met. And I had an editor say to me, what's the big deal? There's already been a global disease that's wiped out. We've already done it with smallpox. Why do we care about a second one? I mean, another challenge for global health is, well, in fact, since I brought up polio, let me tell you about trying to sell a guinea worm story. I was over in Nigeria looking at a guinea worm project and came back very interested, did a story on what I'd seen and tried to do subsequent stories as it's getting closer and closer and looking to beat out polio. Every time I bring up guinea worm, I get a big, giant ooh. My editors say, you know, people listen to the radio while they're eating breakfast, they're eating dinner. They do not want to hear about guinea worm. So that's another challenge that's faced. The basic underlying premise of what I have to say here is that global health issues, for whatever reasons, are uncovered. And as I promised, I'm going to go through mental illness to show you a little bit more about why they're uncovered and what that means and what you can do, again, what you can do about it. And I picked mental health because A, it's an interest of mine, and B, you know, saying there's no health without mental health, so you would think that mental health issues, global mental health issues, would be covered well. I don't think they are. I can't prove that. I can't prove that regular, you know, other neglected tropical diseases are covered well, although the very word neglected in there suggests that they're not. Journalism isn't a science. There's no goal of we need to get this many stories on, or, you know, editors and reporters basically decide on stories on their own biases. And that's always a challenge. But when you look at it, you know, stories like mental health, like neglected tropical diseases, do need to be told as much as other stories like HIV/AIDS, which are a little easier to tell because there's a local effect. When you look at mental health, 12%, I have to look at this number here. You all know about DALYs, Disability Adjusted Life Years. 12% of the DALYs lost, you know, when you look at everything, are due to mental illnesses. I mean, that makes it worth telling, and yet we see it's not really well told. I don't know if any of you were at Ezra Susser's talk yesterday where he called mental health the Cinderella of global health. It's the most neglected of the neglected conditions. It's not even a part of the Millennium Development Goals, which I just learned yesterday and was quite shocked to hear. I tried to quantify this, you know, figuring this was a conference of scientists and maybe I should do my best. I couldn't. I went to one of the search engines that people use a lot to look at what's been reported on in the media. I went to LexisNexis and found that looking at 2009, searching the terms global burden of disease and mental illness in English language papers, it was 22 articles in the whole year, and that's pretty sad. Neglected tropical diseases did worse, actually, with 3, and HIV on this particular search got 72. So that's 3.5 times as many as mental health. Mental illness needs a press agent, I think, more than, say, something like HIV/AIDS. And it's because, well, I'm going to get to that in a minute. It's not an infectious disease. You can always scare people with infectious diseases, but I'll talk more about that. But let's take a hypothetical, which isn't so hypothetical because I'm working on a story now about mental illness in a developing country. Problem number one for me is language. If I go to a country where English isn't the native language, I've got trouble on a radio story because it's going to be coming through an interpreter that always puts listeners a little one step further away. A print reporter is going to have problems because, unless they speak the language very fluently, because they're going to be working through an interpreter, and that's really difficult. There are all the cultural differences to deal with. With mental health, where's the stigma? What is the problem? A comparative story with a non-mental illness story was when I was doing, I don't know how many of you remember it's now called the Sin Nombre virus that was in New Mexico about 15 years ago, came up among the Navajo. It was a hantavirus, but it was a new virus, a lot of interest. Navajo don't talk about people who've died within 4 days of their death because you interrupt their trip to heaven. So you've got all these reporters running around trying to find out, where these people might have gotten infected, what's the loss to the community, trying to report it the way a reporter would, and the Navajo are running it away from them as fast as they could. So that's cultural differences. Numbers are always good for any kind of news story because you want to give a sense of what the issue is, and numbers are very good in certain areas of global mental health or global health issues. Mental health, they've been a problem back up until about 2001 when the World Health Organization came out with its annual report that focused on mental illness numbers. So numbers are getting a little bit better. The Lancet series, I don't know if any of you saw that on mental illness about 3 years ago, was trying to quantify. But that's always good if you're trying to sell your story to have a number. Access for any story is an issue, and it's a challenge for reporters. I think Jim touched on this a little bit. And when I was in Haiti after the earthquake, there was a photojournalist who kept jumping in and taking pictures of women in labor, and this is among a community of people who don't like their pictures taken. I mean, it got so bad I started actually blocking her shot, which is something journalists generally don't do to one another. But mental illness is a special challenge when you're talking to, in an area where there's stigma, and if you don't understand the culture and don't understand the level of stigma or how it's dealt with, that can be a real problem, and that can't Actually, I have to say, with neglected tropical diseases, there was no stigma. I was in a little town where one of the health workers I was with asked this whole group of about 30 or 40 little kids how many of them had red urine. Half of them raised their hand, and they're all laughing, and it was pretty funny to them. So there's no stigma there, but that's something that a reporter coming in has to figure out. And the final issue is making the reader care. Again, how do you make listeners care? I think a good story is a good story. And when you can start the story and tell them, get them interested in it to the point. I'm not going to tell you the end of the story. You've got to read, you've got to hang out. Is this person going to survive? Is this mother going to be able to care for her child? I think that any mother anywhere would read that particular story. And again, if you've got a mystery going, you've got something. I'm just checking the time. I've got a few minutes here. So I'll start with the final section, which is my tips to you guys for getting coverage, because it's, again, from the reasons I said before, I think it's a really good idea that global health issues get coverage. One is to provide access. With the caveat, you should know if a reporter contacts you, you really need to know who that reporter is. If it's that photojournalist who I ran into in Haiti, I would run the other way. If you've got a computer with you and you're encountering somebody in the field, Google that person, talk to your public information officer if that person's nearby. That's not always true. When I was at the tsunami in Indonesia, I had to do an interview. I finally talked this guy into doing an interview before he worked for USAID, and I got him to talk to me before, and I promised him I wouldn't run it. Luckily for me, he had heard some of my stories, so he knew that I would stick by it. So access, do your best. If you've got numbers on hand, and journalists don't need 10 numbers. I can tell a story with the right number, with the single right number. So if you've got a number on, like the WHO DALY number for mental illness, that's a great number to have. You can just say to people, this is causing a tremendous burden. In the middle of the story about a person or a family who's being burdened. That real human being is very important. A woman in Uganda with postpartum depression, somebody in Cambodia with PTSD, a man in Indonesia with schizophrenia, to have that real person can tell a story, or to have a real health worker. I mean, you know, you can do a story, anybody actually could do a story on Paul Farmer, if you can get to, I mean that in a good way. The nurse, you know, if you can find a nurse in Mali who returned to her country, you know, bucking the trend of leaving after being trained. What else can you, so if you've got people like that, present them, and you've got friends in the media, present them. There's a phrase in the media, news is something that happens to editors. It's also, because they make the decisions, sorry, Joe. It's also something that happens at cocktail parties where people, you know, my editor will come in after a weekend after she's met somebody, and suddenly I have an assignment because somebody was talking to them about something. Other things to do to get coverage, grants are good with a caveat. They work, but you have to be very careful, as who was talking about, Richard was talking about the case of, you know, the grantor wanting to get a little bit too involved. Full disclosure here, that the story I'm working on now on mental illness in a developing country in Uganda, I'm doing that with a grant from the Carter Center. But it's a very open-ended grant. I proposed a story on mental illness in a developing country, and I didn't say where, I didn't say what I was going to do, and I got the money. So those are good grants. If you've got something new, let the media know. After that Lancet or JAMA had the story about, or had an editorial basically, about the importance of oncology programs in developing countries. Boy, if you were running one of those, the first thing you should have done was gotten on the phone to somebody in the media who you know and say, hey, we've got this program going, you know, setting up an oncology program in the developing countries. And then finally, what happens when you do get involved with the media? It can work against you. I'm not going to say that it can't, and if that comes up in questions, I won't deny it. But if you come across someone like me or like Tom in the middle of a disaster, you know if you can speak to me, and if you can't, find somebody who can. I prefer that you speak to me directly. Know that I'm being deluged in a case like that by NGOs from every country. Every time I've covered a disaster, I would never wear a press card because every NGO in the world wants to be on the evening news or on the radio so that they can know that they're there. So if you're coming to me, it's great if you've got something unique. It can be done. The good news that I want to say, I tend to be a pessimist. I look out on a day like today in Seattle and think, oh yeah, but the winter's coming. There is good news here, and I'm going to end on a point from a public radio person who's head of PRI, which is actually separate from NPR and a whole different story, but they put on a lot of great news programming, including the show The World. In a speech a couple of years ago, she pointed out that some of the TV news stations or the TV news networks are picking up more bureaus. She cited a Pew study that showed for the public in 2002, 37% said that they followed foreign news coverage. It was 52% in 2004, so there's a greater interest in foreign news. Other good news, people like Tom, he's got a blog, he's got access, he's got a whole new way of access, and I think he's going to talk about that. People can get their news, even if the local or national media aren't covering it, they can get it now from people like Tom. There's another place, Global Health Frontline News, which is going to be like Politico.com. I should admit I'm an unpaid advisor on their board. They're going to be providing free videos to networks. So all in all, if you listen to NPR this morning, you heard two stories related to the Millennium Development Goals. There are big enough news things happening now that they're triggering more coverage. Gates, just by the extent of the money that's involved there, that's triggering coverage. It's triggering media interest. So I think things are getting better, and my bottom line to you guys is you can make it even better than that.